So we're here today to talk to you about pitch subtypes and identifying them, analyzing them. This is something that obviously is of importance for several reasons. Many of which have come up during this conference. We saw yesterday the seam shifted wake stuff where you see certain pitchers that are intentionally throwing multiple types of the same pitch, like the example that was given multiple times over of Kyle Hendricks, and then but alternately you have certain types of pitchers that may be throwing multiple types of the same pitch for unintentional reasons, and that could potentially relate to a lot of the biomechanical stuff that we've seen at the conference, as it potentially relates to how good a pitcher's mechanics are in his ability to repeat them, or issues of fatigue or injury, and something which we'll actually get into a little bit later in the presentation. But with this presentation that we're giving, Rylan and I, we're jointly giving it. Rylan is not a member of SIS. He, his main profession is actually outside the baseball industry, but he's been, a lot of you may actually recognize his name because he's been in the in various roles in the industry for a number of years, having he's consulted for a major league team. He's written for Fangraphs, and right now he's the administrator for Bill James Online, which is sort of how our relationship kind of began, because we're affiliated with that site as well. And what we're going to do here is, the way that this project started, Rylan came to us with an idea, and I'll let him speak to a little bit more of the, sort of the inspiration for that idea, and then the work that he did on it. But he came to us with an idea of looking into this sort of, of determining pitch subtypes and that kind of thing. But he needed data, and we as SIS, we have pitch charting data that we, pitch charting operation that we've had for the entire existence of our company, and so it sort of made for a nice little match, and we've been working on this project now going back, let's see, Rylan first reached out to us back in 2018 on this. So we've been working on it for a little while, trying to get everything developed. And what I'm going to do is I'll just start by sort of giving a little bit of a quick background on some of the details of our pitch charting operation. And then Rylan will get into some of his thoughts in terms of what inspired him to do this project, and the work that then went into it once he got the data from us, and both sort of the research and development of that, as well as the development of a tool that we've put together to sort of help dig into this data some more. And then I'll come back on at the end to sort of talking about some research implications, some more generalized research implications that some of this data can provide. So again, just to kind of jump in and give you a brief overview of what we do on the pitch charting side and how it relates to this project. So we have a large team of video scouts that well-trained video scouts that we have charting every Major League Baseball game. With that, we're looking at their charting pitch type, pitch location, pitch velocity, and we even have have them charting the location that the catcher sets up as his target, before the pitch is thrown. So with all of that, as it relates specifically to pitch type, they obviously the video scouts are making their determinations. We give them some tools to help them out, given that we're as analytically inclined as we are as a company. Our R&D team has taken a crack at creating what we've called a pitch guesser, an automated pitch guesser that just using some of the information available on velocity and movement of the pitch and the historical velocities and movements that a given pitcher has had associated with each of his pitch types. We can kind of suggest, or the pitch guesser can suggest a pitch type to just help out the video scouts. But ultimately, it's the video scouts that are making that determination, but based on what they see on the pitch, what they may sort of see in terms of other information, whether they can see the catcher's signs, that kind of thing. And then obviously, our pitch catcher information and any other information that they sort of have available to them. It's their final determination. And we even have a couple passes at this to make sure that we're getting everything right. And then the last point is that I'll make is that with these primary pitch types that we're charting for pitchers, we chart them according to what the pitcher himself calls the pitches within his arsenal. So if a pitcher says that he throws a slider, we're charting it as a slider. If he says he throws a curveball, we're charting it as a curveball. As that relates to this subtypes research that we've done, if as things get broken down for an individual pitcher, even if one pitcher's slider looks very similar to another pitcher's curveball, those two are still treated, any subtypes that the first pitcher throws are going to be classified within the slider subtypes. Any pitches that the second pitcher throws are going to be classified within the curveball subtypes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rylan and let him go.
Thanks, Joe. So this idea of a subtype should sound familiar to a lot of you. In fact, this same presentation, our same conference last year, Gregory Dorosic, Eno Saris, who I worked with at Fangraphs, and Joe Camp gave the same presentation, basically. Not the exact same presentation, but the idea of subtypes and using k-means clustering to be more granular and more objective with how we subclassify pitch types. And it was a great presentation. And they did some really insightful work around subtype pairings. We're going to try to occupy a different part of subtype analysis and answer different questions. I started this in 2018, and I came at this from the angle of, let's start by, irrespective of pitch type, let's just cluster all the pitches and see what it tells us. And if you do that, the algorithm tells you there's about 4 pitches. Talk to any pitcher, talk to any catcher, talk to any hitter, they'll tell you there's way more. And so I actually reached out to Eno in 2018 because he knows more about pitching than anybody I've met. And he was like, that's crazy. We're working on the same thing and we run into the same problem, which made me think that I was onto something if I run into the same problems with those guys. And so we eventually figured it out. We took a slightly different approach than that group took. Basically, it was the same, but if I remember correctly, they did a few things differently. They used StatCast classifications for pitch types. We're using the SIS classifications. I believe they also incorporated spin rate. We did not find that it demonstrably improved the tightness of the clusters. And then I think lastly, if I'm not mistaken, they also clustered lefties and righties independently of one another, whereas we, and I could be wrong about this, but they clustered lefties and righties separately. We clustered everybody together and adjusted horizontal movement for pitcher handedness. But in the end, we arrived at roughly the same results, which is 3 to 4 subtypes per pitch type, which I'm going to take as a compliment and validation that we did it somewhat right. And so some of the questions that we're going to answer, we'll try to answer some very fundamental questions about pitch types. Mainly, is throwing multiple pitch types a good thing or a bad thing? As good thing as bad thing in terms of performance outcomes and injury risk. And then we'll also try to dissect, is it something that people do intentionally or unintentionally? Is it a sign of command for being able to mix your pitches effectively, or is it a sign of inconsistency and a lack of repeat in your delivery? So those are some of the questions that we'll try to answer here. And then the other thing I'll say is, and Joe mentioned this, the reason we're coming here a year later is we spent a lot of time working on a tool that would help us sort of scalably analyze pitchers and the subtypes they throw. And we'll show that very briefly, but really we want to focus on the research. So a couple of years ago, I was watching a game. I don't remember exactly who was pitching. I don't even remember the team. I think it was the Giants, because I have Mike Kruko's voice burned in my brain shouting that was his B slider. And that was interesting. I'd never heard of a B slider before. I'd heard of a hard slider, a sweeping slider, a hanging slider, never a B slider. Go over to Fangraphs, and sure enough, there's no B slider. There's just slider. And what's interesting about a B slider versus the other types of sliders is that by definition, it infers that there's an A slider. but it also leaves open the possibility that there's a C slider, the D slider, and on and on. And so that got me thinking, how many types of sliders are there? How many pitchers throw multiple types of sliders? And what makes one slider different from another? It stands to reason that if there's multiple types of sliders, there's multiple other pitches. And if so, who throws them? When we look at a pitch's average velocity, average movement, average spin rate, what are we missing when we look at it from that elevation? And if we can be more granular, if we can be more objective with how we classify pitches, it might help us make better decisions. And so we got to clustering within subtypes. And what we found was that there are basically 3 to 4 different subtypes depending on the pitch of every pitch type. And within a single pitch type, the differences between subtypes can be stark. So for example, we found that there are 3 types of changeups. If you look at the changeup subtype with the most horizontal break versus the changeup with the least, almost a foot of break separates that. That's 11 inches. Same thing with the slider. If you look at vertical break, the differences are even larger. It's over a foot for a curveball between the curveball with the most drop and the curveball with the least. And then from a velocity standpoint, we're looking at anywhere between 4 and 7.5 miles per hour differences. And that's just within a single pitch type. So here's what we're talking about here. This is a 3D scatter plot of every subtype that we found, color-coded by the traditional pitch type family. So all 4 seamers are one color, all changeups are another color. That bright green cluster at the bottom, those are knuckleballs. Those are all the same color. And I guess what I was hoping to see here when I started this were kind of tightly packed clusters of dots of all the same color, with maybe some peppering around changeups and splitters, or some mixing of sliders and cutters. I wouldn't say that this is random, but it's a lot more heterogeneous than I thought it was going to be. It shows that there's a lot more overlap between pitch types than maybe I had initially thought when going into this. Here's what we typically think of when we think of pitch types. These are the 8 pitch types. You got a vertical break along the y-axis, horizontal break along the x, color-coded for heat, for velocity. So red is hot, blue is cold. Nothing particularly insightful or life-changing about this. 4 seamers, not a lot of vertical break, not a lot of horizontal break, thrown really hard. Changeups and splitters, pretty close to one another. Curveballs, a lot of drop, a lot of horizontal break, not very fast. But when you zoom in a bit and you start taking a look at subtypes, the distinctions become much less clear. And here we have 4 different groupings, families of different subtypes that come from different pitch types. So if we go from left to right, we see over here, we've got 5 pitches, changeups, splitters, and 2 seamers. They're all very tightly clustered together. Here we see another combination of splitters and changeups. Over here, we've got your sliders and your cutters that kind of mixed with one another. And on the right, this is probably what we talked about when we talk about a slurve. A slider 3 and a curveball 2, very similar in terms of both movement and velocity. So what this tells us is that even though we've been talking about it for 150 years, this guy throws a curveball, this guy throws a slider, this guy throws a fastball, traditional pitch types are not monolithic, and maybe we shouldn't be treating them as such. And that the differences within pitch types often are greater than differences across pitch types. I got to apologize for the next slide. It's probably the worst slide I ever made. But I think talking to a group of quants, it's important. And to me, it hits home better than any visual ever could. So this is a matrix of the Euclidean distances, or the distances in space between each subtype and every other subtype. If you go back to that 3D scatter plot, this is basically the distance between the dots. So we have all 26 subtypes across the top, the same 26 subtypes across the side. And you'll notice 3 different colors here. Black, that's basic. That's just the intersection between a subtype and itself. The distance is 0. But in each column, there's 1 red cell. And that red cell is the minimum value of that column. In other words, it represents that intersection, wherever you see red, represents this subtype's closest neighbor. So if we start with 2-seam fastball 1 and we go all the way down until we see the red, we see that its closest neighbor, its most similar subtype, is actually a split finger 1. If we go to curveball 2 over here, we go all the way down, we see that its closest neighbor is a slider. And if we go to cut fastball 2, all the way down, we see this number 0.272. This is the smallest value on the entire sheet. This is saying that a cut fastball 2 is basically the exact same pitch as a slider 3. I think I read in the news recently that Tyler Glasnow is working on a pitch that's basically a combination of a cutter and a slider. I'm really, he used a term that's probably a little bit inappropriate, but in describing it. But I'm very eager to see what that actually looks like in terms of, movement, because it's probably, if it's what he's describing, it's probably this pitch right here. So again, red is the closest neighbor. The third color on here is yellow. Yellow represents subtypes whose closest neighbor also belongs to the same pitch type family. So subtypes whose closest neighbor, most similar pitch, also happens to share the same traditional pitch type. So 2-seam fastball 3, its closest neighbor is also a 2-seamer. Go over here to 4-seam fastball 2, its closest neighbor, also a 4-seamer. There are 26 subtypes of pitches here, only 9 of which have a neighbor who belong to the same, a closest neighbor who belongs to the same pitch type. This means that 2/3 of subtypes are more similar to a subtype from a completely different pitch family than to one from within its own. So when we talk about a slider that's thrown by Noah Syndergaard in the low 90s with not very much horizontal break, and we talk about a slider thrown by Pat Corbin, which is almost like a curveball, why do we call them both sliders? Or a Ben Sheets curveball, I'm dating myself here, but like a Ben Sheets curveball versus a Barry Zito curveball. Totally different pitches, totally different intents, resulting in different outcomes, yet we both call them curveballs. So if we know this, if we know that subtypes, pitch types are largely an arbitrary and grossly categorical exercise, how can we make better decisions as coaches, as analysts about pitching? And I think one fundamental question is and what we found is that the vast majority of pitchers, throw multiple types of at least one pitch. Most throw multiple types of multiple pitches. And the question becomes, is that on purpose or is that on accident? So I want to show you a couple case studies here. Kenta Maeda and his slider. He throws 2. He throws, at least he did in 2020, in roughly equal measure. Slider 1, which has a great swinging strike rate. It tends to be a tick and a half harder, with almost a foot less horizontal break and about a quarter of a foot, half a foot less horizontal break, and similarly less vertical break as well. He throws that 17% of the time. He throws a slider 2, which is slower and has more movement 18% of the time. But if you look at how he throws it based on hitter handedness, you can see that roughly equal distribution changes greatly to the point where 85% of his sliders that he throws to lefties are the slower type. And to righties, that's reversed. Where 3/4 of the sliders he throws are the hard sliders. Now, not only does that seem to matter, which batter he faces, it also seems to matter the count. So if you look at 3-ball counts to lefties, this number 51%, this is not of sliders. This is 51% of all pitches. So if you're a lefty in a 3-ball count, there's a greater than 50% chance that if you're facing Kenta Maeda, not only are you going to see a slider, but you're going to see his slow slider. This is so stark, these differences, that it's hard to believe that this is not done intentionally. Let's look at another example. This is Jaime Barria. Here we have all of the slider subtypes, I think a minimum of 100 thrown last year, sorted descendingly by run value. So these are the most effective slider subtypes thrown last year. Jaime Barria's got the 4th most effective slider in terms of run value. And if you look at his overall slider, so not just subtype slider 1, but all of his sliders, I think he had like a top 7 or top 8 slider by run value or pitch value at least last year. So that seems to make sense, right? But let's zoom in on Jaime Barria here for a second. And we can see that his slider 1, which was harder and had less break and was tighter, was something he threw less than half of. He threw that in less than half of his sliders. And the other slider he threw, his slider 2, Far less effective. Far less effective. 4% as far as swinging strike rate. It got 4.5% fewer swinging strikes in the league average slider. It's basically an average pitch. This is probably a case where if Kenta Maeda, or if Jaime Barria could identify things that he was doing that led to him throwing his slider too, and could reduce that, that would improve his outcomes. So we have Kenta Maeda, who's almost certainly changing and intentionally throwing a different type of slider, and Jaime Barria, who could probably benefit drastically by figuring out how to throw his best slider, one of the best sliders in the league, more than half the time he throws a slider. So those are a couple case studies where we think that intent and maybe differing. And so with that, I'm going to toss it over to Joe, because I think that's a nice transition to what are some of the implications of throwing subtypes.
Yeah,
Joe?
So great. So what, Rylan obviously just went through was a demonstration of the tool that we built. And, obviously that provides lots of capabilities in terms of looking at specific pitchers and looking at being able to break those things down by various filters, whether it's related to, dates or handedness or, performance metrics like swinging strike rate or run value. And it also provides capabilities with, in terms of looking at, putting together playlists, video playlists of certain pitches that pitchers have thrown. But so, where that tool sort of allows kind of deep dives into individual pitchers or pitchers within a given team, for use by front offices and or coaching staffs or other individuals who want to look kind of specifically at those pitchers. We also wanted to take a look at just some more overarching sort of research implications that the data could provide. Now, one thing that I'll sort of caveat this with is just to sort of say that, most of the work that we put in up to now has been developing that tool. So these research questions that we've looked into are very preliminary at this point, meant, not necessarily to show anything absolutely definitive at this point, but things that we were interested in that we think are starting to show some signal of stuff that we might want to look into deeper, whether that's us or somebody else with access to this data. So first question we asked ourselves is throwing many subtypes, multiple subtypes, an effective strategy. So what you can see with this graph is on the x-axis, we're just looking at 2019 data and the number of subtypes thrown, just total subtypes thrown by individual pitchers, and then along the y-axis, their 2019 SABR. So generally speaking, you can kind of see that there's sort of this trend line, upward, where the more subtypes that are thrown by pitchers, generally the higher SABR will be across the league. So therefore, worse performance. Now, that's all of subtypes, but again, we know that notionally, not all subtypes are intentionally thrown, right? So if we take a look specifically at something that we've called strays, just a term that we made up to kind of look at pitches that aren't necessarily intentionally thrown. So the way that we've just defined strays is to sort of say any pitch that's thrown, any subtype that's thrown less than 2.5% of the time as it relates to the total number of subtypes that a pitcher throws. So 2.5% is a little bit arbitrary. We kind of just pick that number in that, like, generally speaking, if for primary pitch types, a pitcher would need to throw a pitch about 10% of the time for it to be sort of a legitimate part of his arsenal. And therefore, if there's up to 4 subtypes per primary pitch type, that's where we got 2.5 from. Again, a little bit arbitrary, but a good starting point for what we wanted to look at. So here, with this plot, we're looking at the percentage of pitches, just in total stray pitches as a percentage of the total number of pitches that a pitcher threw in 2019. And again, looking at that against SABR. And again, same sort of relationship where the more strays, individual strays that a pitcher throws, the generally speaking across the league, the worse their performances. And if we take a look at the next slide, this basically shows something, basically the same thing. Instead of looking at total number of stray pitches thrown, this is actually just looking at stray subtypes thrown. And again, same kind of relationship. But of course, so those are stray. So theoretically, those are pitches that are unintentionally thrown, and it makes some sense that those would result in potentially worse performance. Looking at the next slide, we're sort of looking at the flip side of that, which is these repeatable subtypes, pitches that are thrown more than 2.5% of the time. And we still see a similar relationship. Again, the more pitch subtypes that pitchers throw as it relates to these repeatable types, these ones where they're theoretically intentionally throwing these, we still generally see a more sort of negative trend as the number of subtypes that a pitcher throws increases. But the slope of this line is much shallower than the slope of that strays line. So again, standing to reason that in terms of the pitches that a pitcher is intending to throw, it's not as negative an effect as those pitches that are kind of getting away from pitchers. Well, one caveat we'll sort of say here is we know that we did take a look, and obviously starting pitchers throw more subtypes than relievers generally do. But for the simplicity of this presentation, we've sort of just kept everything all together. Now, so that's as things relate to subtypes and general performance. One thing that we obviously wanted to then kind of take a look at is how things correlate with injury and subtypes thrown. So, you can see these two histograms and injury data. Two of my colleagues, Matt and John, on Thursday gave a presentation on the injury risk models that we've been working on recently. And this data is, the subtype stuff is not currently incorporated into that, but something that we may want to start looking into, because we took our injury data and, again, just looking at 2019, looked at pitchers who had some kind of injury event occur as it related to their arm, hand, wrist, elbow, shoulder, and broke those into two groups, those who did have an injury event at some point during the 2019 season and those that didn't. And those two histograms, the one on the left is just looking at all subtypes thrown, and you can see that the dark blue, the pitchers that did have an injury associated with them, threw more subtypes than the pitchers that didn't, that light blue band. And then if you look at the right-hand side, those are looking more specifically just at strays. And again, same thing, more subtypes thrown by those that had some injury event occur with them. And there is some statistical significance here, again, so something that we'll want to look into a little bit more as we go forward. So yeah, just to sort of wrap things up, we also looked at things on a team level, and again, similar trends. The teams that had fewer subtypes thrown per primary pitch type generally had better performance. You can kind of see we color coded these for total number of injury events. So teams that experience more injuries, the darker red dots, you can see those more to the right. So again, injury obviously makes a difference. And then, just finally with that, our sort of last slide, this one actually is not just 2019, this is 17 through 20, just kind of taking a look at teams that have sort of the most consistent number of subtypes per pitch type. You'll see on the far left there, Tampa, Oakland, and the Mets kind of separate themselves in terms of fewest subtypes per primary pitch type, as opposed to, say, on the right, where you've got Arizona and Colorado. Again, something else that we probably want to take a little bit more of a look into, in that, those two are teams that obviously are generally associated with ballparks that have higher offensive environments, and whether there's anything potentially there that might be worth digging into more. So That's our presentation. If we have any time, still a few minutes, we can try to take some questions. And let's look at the Q&A list here. So just starting at the top, did you account for where the break happens? For example, does the slider break later than the changeup? And I don't know, Rylan, do you want to sort of start talking through stuff?
We did not differentiate on where it was. We just looked at StatCast data, where it crossed at home plate versus where it would have crossed had it traveled in a straight path. So no in terms of where the movement took place.
So there's a question here, Rylan, and did you explore using soft or fuzzy clustering methods in addition to k-means?
No, we pretty much just use k-means and elbow plots to determine this. I've never seen Phil says, I've never seen a biz data profile page like this for a player. Is it available to the public or just for clients of Sports Info Solutions? That's a great question for folks at Sports Info Solutions. I believe the latter.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, at this point, the tool that Rylan was demonstrating is something that's currently only available to clients, but you know, it's something that, well, yeah, I'll just sort of leave it at that. Right now, that's just available to clients.
Christian Eggers asks, where did Yu Darvish, Zach Greinke, and Trevor Bauer show up in this data? Yu Darvish, on one, he was definitely on the far right tail in terms of number of subtypes thrown. He was probably the one who, you know, as we saw in the scatter plots, more subtypes generally correlates with poorer outcomes. He was not one of those. He was an exception to that rule. He threw a ton. I want to say 15 or 16 or 18, I think, actually, subtypes. I should double check that. But yeah, Yu Darvish was one of the first pitchers I went to see how this would turn out, and he does so quite effectively, obviously. Trevor Bauer, he had multiple types of multiple pitches. I don't remember off the top of my head. And then Greinke, of course, with the curveballs. And I'm also very excited to see Jesus Luzardo, who's now throwing what I believe they're calling a turkey sub, which is like it sounds like it's an ephus pitch. I haven't seen it, but it's a 65 or 60 mile an hour curveball, especially given what we found that Oakland has typically been on the lower end of subtypes for pitch types. I'm excited to see how that develops.
There's a couple questions here related to Sierra. One, basically just to explain what Sierra is for anybody that is unaware. It's an ERA estimator, so something that takes into account the you know, outcomes related to pitches and or you know, to the events that a pitcher's involved in, and you know, presents a metric as, you know, it's similar to ERA, but is more predictive of future ERA than ERA itself. But you can kind of think of it as yeah, sort of an ERA estimator. And where's the second question? Was there a reason why we chose Sierra specifically as a response rather than another metric? And not particularly. We were, again, just sort of you know, looking at doing some preliminary stuff and figured, you know, Sierra would be a little bit more predictive than, or you know, interesting than say just straight ERA, but no particular reason to have chosen Sierra.